He had one rule, carved into the ideological foundation of the greatest military expansion in human history, enforced by a specialized corps of trained rhetoricians attached to every fleet that left Terra's orbit, backed by an intelligence apparatus with explicit authorization to suppress all competing belief systems through what the lore delicately describes as extreme prejudice. There are no gods. The universe is rational. Religion and superstition have divided humanity for long enough, and the emperor of mankind, ancient beyond any mortal reckoning, the most powerful human psyker ever born, isn't a divine being. Call him a god and you will hear about it. The most famous instance of what hearing about it looks like is the city of Monarchia. Monarchia stood on the world of Khur, and it wasn't just a city, it was a monument. The Word-Bearers Legion, commanded by Primarch Lorgar Aurelian, had constructed it as a physical expression of the theological conviction that the emperor of mankind was a god who deserved cities shaped like prayers. The citizens of Monarchia organized their entire existence around worship. The architecture made the devotion structural. Every public space was built on the premise that the man who unified Terra and launched the Great Crusade was divine, that the correct response to his existence wasn't rational admiration, but religious supplication. His response was to order the Ultramarines to level every stone, not the temple specifically, the city, because the worship itself was the offense, not the architecture expressing it, but the premise underneath. The cultural fact of an entire population arranging their lives around calling him what he refused to be. He stood in the rubble afterward and addressed Lorgar directly. Worshipping him was a poison to truth, and calling him a god was the one lie he had always sought to destroy. That direct quote from the lore is the measuring stick. That city, its absence, and those specific words are what every chapter in this analysis gets weighed against. He doesn't currently have the ability to do any weighing. He's been on the Golden Throne since the siege of Terra destroyed his body, locked into an ancient device that functions as both life support and the power source for the Astronomicon, the psychic navigational beacon without which Imperial ships can't navigate the warp, without which the Imperium's interstellar civilization collapses within a generation. He isn't dormant, he is projecting, continuously and actively, sustaining the beacon that keeps the whole enterprise from folding, fed by the life energies of 1,000 psykers sacrificed to him every single solar day. 1,000 per day. That number appears in print at the front of Black Library novels. Standard preface language, foundational enough to the setting's operational reality that it became boilerplate. The canonical record indicates that figure reportedly escalated to roughly 4 times the original rate in the later millennia, as the throne's mechanisms degraded and the Astronomicon required ever greater psychic input. 1,000 was the floor. It was nowhere near the ceiling. At that baseline rate alone, from the early 32nd millennium, when the throne's daily sacrifice schedule is established in the lore, through the closing decades of the 41st, the arithmetic of sustained industrial sacrifice reaches into territory that no single number adequately captures. He didn't choose this. His servants chose it for him when they looked at what the siege had left and decided a barely living emperor was better than a dead one. But the architecture of what that choice created, a civilization requiring human sacrifice at scale, directed at a motionless divine figure every single day without exception, to maintain basic function, is the background condition against which every verdict in this analysis gets delivered. He hasn't woken up. He can't. He's been there, in agony or something beyond agony, for 10,000 years. But the lore tells us exactly what he built, what he demanded, and what happened to every institution he built it through during the millennia he's been unable to speak. Those verdicts write themselves. So we're going to deliver them. 6 chapters, named now in the order they get evaluated because the promise is contractual. Salamanders, Black Templars, Blood Angels, Grey Knights, Space Wolves, Lamenters. Every one of them weighed against the imperial truth, His explicit anti-religion secular manifesto, the measuring stick he was willing to destroy cities to defend. Verdicts delivered. No appeals. No Codex Astartes footnotes from Gilliman to soften the landing. The thesis before we begin. Every chapter drifted during 10 millennia in which the imperial cult was the water they swam in. But drift toward compassion and drift toward worship are categorically different verdicts, and the villain driving every single judgment here isn't chaos, isn't any Xenos race, isn't any Primarch who turned. It's the institutional rot that consumed the imperial truth while the emperor was too destroyed to stop it, and which he, through the specific choice he made on the day of the siege, helped make inevitable. That last part matters. We'll get there. The imperial truth wasn't a loosely held philosophical preference or a political talking point the emperor deployed when convenient. It was enforced doctrine, and he enforced it personally and specifically. During the Great Crusade of the 30th millennium, the emperor deployed imperial iterators with every expeditionary fleet, trained orators and rhetoricians whose specific assignment was the systematic conversion of newly liberated worlds to atheism. Not merely the suppression of the worst cult behaviors, not just discouraging the most active religious institutions, conversion. World by world, civilization by civilization, every population that the Great Crusade folded back into humanity's reunited empire received an iterator standing in whatever remained of their old religious spaces and explaining that there was no divine, no supernatural, no cosmic purpose behind any of it. Just humanity, just reason, just the rational universe and mankind's rightful place at its apex. The philosophical foundation of this project, the universe operates purely by rational laws science had not yet fully mapped. Any appearance of the supernatural was an aspect of universal science humanity hadn't yet understood, not evidence of actual gods or daemons. Mankind had a manifest destiny to rule the stars, and that destiny required a species unified by reason rather than divided by competing faiths. Religion had historically fragmented humanity's potential. The iterators were deployed to end that pattern permanently. The enforcement wasn't purely rhetorical. An imperial intelligence apparatus operated with authorization to suppress faiths through extreme prejudice when rhetoric wasn't sufficient. Monarchia demonstrated what non-rhetorical enforcement looked like when the violation was significant enough. A city leveled because its premise was unacceptable. Now the structural problem, which matters for every judgment that follows. The emperor knew the warp existed. He knew chaos was real, active, and directly threatening. He spent his entire existence navigating warp energies at a scale no other human approached. The most powerful human psyker ever born can't claim ignorance of the metaphysics his power operates within. His strategy for weakening the Chaos God's power was specific and deliberate. Starve them of belief. If nobody believes in supernatural forces, the warp entities that feed on mortal belief can't grow. The containment logic was sophisticated. It required, as a practical operational condition, that no one in his civilization know the truth about how the universe actually functioned. So he left it out. The secular manifesto that his iterators deployed on 10,000 worlds was built on a deliberate omission of the most important fact about the nature of reality. He told humanity there were no gods. He knew there were. He concealed it because the concealment served the goal of weakening the very gods he was hiding from his own people. When Horus fell to chaos, when demons physically walked the soil of Terra during the siege, when the warp bled into reality at maximum possible scale, the foundational claim of the imperial truth was disproven in the most visceral terms available. The emperor's own corrupted sons used the things he denied existed to nearly burn his capital to the ground. Religious faith in the emperor began offering people genuine psychic protection against demonic threats, because 40,000's metaphysics are what they are. Belief has weight in the warp, and faith in a being as psychically powerful as the emperor provided real armor against forces that the imperial truth had no conceptual vocabulary for addressing. The secular framework collapsed because the evidence against it was comprehensive, physical, and impossible to contain. What replaced it was the imperial cult, the emperor as God-emperor, worship as mandatory infrastructure, the ecclesiarchy as the institutional machinery that turned his martyrdom on the Golden Throne into the founding event of a galactic religion. The chapters were born into that imperium. The imperial truth had ceased to function as operational doctrine before most of them were founded. They had the cult instead, and the cult is what shaped them across 10,000 years. That context doesn't excuse every failure in this proceeding. It does explain the landscape they were navigating. One more thing before the judgments, because it bears directly on the authority of the judge himself. The lore establishes that the emperor was aware Lorgar had been spreading emperor worship before the destruction of Monarchia. The word-bearers had been engaged in this practice for an extended period prior to the censure. He delayed intervening. The most famous single act of the emperor punishing worship for the entire Great Crusade came after he'd allowed the practice to continue. The hanging judge who leveled Monarchia to make a point about deification is the same figure who watched the violation accumulate for a while before making it. Every verdict he delivers carries that precedent, and he knows it better than anyone. He isn't in a clean position. That is established. The verdicts are real regardless. The Salamanders. Acquitted. The Salamanders come from Nocturne, a death world with volcanic activity so catastrophic and cyclically scheduled that survival on its surface requires cooperation above every other priority. Nocturne's geological calendar includes events severe enough to threaten entire settlements on a regular basis. The planet's terrain periodically becomes hostile enough to kill communities that didn't spend their quiet periods preparing to survive the violent ones. The human culture that developed on this world built mutual protection into its foundational architecture before anything else, because the alternative to protecting each other was extinction on a schedule they couldn't prevent. Vulcan, their Primarch, discovered by the Emperor on Nocturne and drawn into the Great Crusade alongside his brothers, carried this worldview into his legion's operational identity. He was a craftsman and a protector before he was a conqueror, shaped by a homeworld that demanded genuine human solidarity as the price of continued existence. After his disappearance following the drop site massacre at Istvan V, the catastrophic opening atrocity of the Horus Heresy, where the Salamanders suffered losses severe enough to compromise their function as a legion, Vulcan's values were formalized as the Promethean cult, the philosophical and operational framework that defines what a salamander is across every generation. The Promethean cult's core commitments are specific: protect the innocent, prioritize civilian lives over tactical convenience, accept personal risk and mission deviation before accepting avoidable mass civilian death. In practice, this means salamander strike forces operating near populated areas maintain precise, deliberate fire even when rapid and destructive fire would achieve the tactical objective faster. It means their forces divert from mission parameters to extract civilians from collapsing structures during active combat operations, incurring casualties in the process that other chapters would categorize as unacceptable tactical waste. Their operational doctrine explicitly treats those casualties as the correct cost of the mission as the Emperor actually defined it, not as the mission as efficiency metrics would define it. The Promethean cult carries the organizational structure of a religious tradition, foundational texts, formalized teachings, the vocabulary of a philosophical school built around a Primarch's example. An imperial iterator reviewing it would identify structural features they'd been deployed to dismantle. The Emperor would raise a specific eyebrow at the architecture of a chapter whose protective values are transmitted through what functions as a devotional framework. The substance of what those values actually produce is the counter-argument that wins. What the Promethean cult enforces in practice isn't supplication to a divine power. It's a values framework directed entirely at people. Protect the civilian, serve the living, absorb cost so the population the Emperor's civilization theoretically exists to protect is actually protected. That premise, that human beings have worth dying to defend, that the civilization being built has an obligation to the people inside it, is the operating principle the Emperor stated as the purpose of the Great Crusade. He unified Terra. He launched his forces across the galaxy. The explicit stated goal was to reunite humanity under a banner that would secure its future against alien threats and internal division. That goal depended, at its foundation, on the premise that humanity was worth securing. The Salamanders took that premise and ran it as operational reality for 10,000 years, in an imperium that has increasingly treated it as rhetorical decoration for policies that serve other priorities entirely. Verdict: acquitted. The Promethean cult gets a long look and a hard question about whether a values framework transmitted through the apparatus of a philosophical tradition constitutes a prohibited religious structure. The answer, operationally, is that what the Salamanders do in the field looks like what the Emperor said he was building civilization to achieve. Sons of Vulcan understood the assignment. The eyebrow comes down. The Blood Angels, acquitted. With weight. The Blood Angels carry a problem they didn't choose, can't put down, and have been managing with extraordinary discipline for 10,000 years, despite it being woven into their biology at the level where discipline has no purchase. Sanguinius, their Primarch, the winged figure who held the walls of the imperial palace through the worst of the siege of Terra before Horus killed him, died with something unresolved in his gene seed's final transmission. Not just his death, but the specific horror of how it happened. Betrayal by a brother, corruption in the most catastrophic possible form, the knowledge in his final seconds of exactly what Horus had become and what stopping him would cost. That specific psychic weight didn't dissipate. It embedded itself into the gene seed every Blood Angel carries, passed down through every generation born after the siege. A permanent alteration to the biological and psychological baseline of an entire chapter's lineage. Two specific inheritances. The red thirst is a genetic flaw producing a drive toward combat-induced bloodlust that intensifies in the heat of battle and requires constant, conscious, active discipline to manage. The Blood Angels train for it. Most manage it. The ones who don't, temporarily, encounter chapter protocols designed around the statistical expectation of failure. Because a genetic flaw this embedded in 10,000 years of gene seed copying will produce failures, and the chapter's response is to manage those failures rather than pretend they don't exist. The Black Rage is categorically worse. It's a psychic echo of Sanguinius's final moments. His death, as he experienced it, encoded in the collective genetic memory every Blood Angel carries, that periodically fractures individual Space Marines entirely. A Blood Angel consumed by the Black Rage does not experience their battle as a present event. They experience the siege of Terra, Horus's betrayal, Sanguinius dying, continuously, immediately, as the only reality their mind has access to. The chapter responds with the Death Company. Space Marines lost to the Black Rage are given black-painted armor in acknowledgement of what they carry, deployed in the most hopeless assault the chapter has available, and given a warrior's death before the madness produces worse outcomes. The Death Company isn't a doctrine the Blood Angels designed as a choice. It's the permanent operational consequence of Sanguinius's death in Horus's hands. None of this is theology. None of it's institutional drift. The Black Rage and Red Thirst are what the Horus heresy inscribed into Sanguinius's surviving sons at a genetic level that 10,000 years of chapter history hasn't touched. Blood Angels developed venerative practices around Sanguinius's memory, ritual forms that accumulated over centuries of living inside his genetic shadow, of watching brothers be consumed by his death echo, of finding ways to make meaning out of an inherited wound that meaning can't actually heal. Venerative practice around a dead Primarch whose loss still physically manifests in their biology every generation isn't the same category as worshipping the Emperor as a living god. It's a chapter that never stopped grieving a father they still carry. The verdict distinction, stated plainly. Choosing theological corruption is one thing. Being genetically haunted by the manner of your Primarch's death is another. Those aren't the same charge, and they don't warrant the same verdict. Then there is Dante. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels is confirmed as the oldest living Loyalist Space Marine not interred within Dreadnought armor. The canonical record puts him at over 1,500 standard years old, with timeline estimates from his M40 birth date running closer to 1,700 or 1,800 years. He has been chapter master for 1,500 of those years. Not chapter master who became a ceremonial figure, actively commanding. The Blood Angels regenerate around him in continuous generational cycles while he remains, an anchor that the chapter can't functionally operate without, and that the Imperium can't afford to lose, watching every generation of brothers form and die while he continues because no one else is what he is, and the chapter's survival requires him to remain. After the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half, he was named Lord Regent of Imperium Nihilus, the entire section of the Imperium cut off from Terra by the Rift, from the Astronomican's light, from any reliable contact with Central Imperial authority. The appointment dropped an entire sundered half of the galaxy onto shoulders that had already been carrying the weight of 15 centuries of continuous loss. At the precise moment in his existence when the weight has long since passed any threshold ordinary human vocabulary has words for. The lore's consistent characterization of Dante's state isn't despair, not breakdown, not a warrior diminished by what he's carried. It's something more specific, an exhaustion so total and so prolonged that it has passed through every stage of ordinary fatigue into a quality that can only be described as the condition of continuing anyway, because the alternative to continuing isn't rest, but the collapse of everything he has already spent 15 centuries holding together. The request that writes itself from his position isn't dramatic, it's quiet. I have served, I have fought, I have held Nihilus together by force of will, and the increasingly concerning implication that I have simply not died yet. Surely this is enough. Can it please be enough? The Emperor's answer, given what Nihilus requires and what Dante is inside it, is no. The injustice of that response is a feature of the setting, not a failure of the narrative. The Blood Angels as a chapter are acquitted on the charges of drift toward corruption. The Black Rage and Red Thirst are wounds, not choices, and 10,000 years of extraordinary service while carrying an inherited genetic catastrophe isn't what the imperial truth was built to condemn. Dante individually receives acknowledgement of a debt that has long since exceeded any reasonable accounting. What he's owed and what he gets are different answers, and the gap between them is the Blood Angels in a single line of lore. The verdict lands correctly. You still feel terrible about it. That's the Blood Angels functioning exactly as designed. The Space Wolves, cleared. The Space Wolves of Fenris aren't tame. They were never designed to be tame. This isn't a complaint leveled at them. It's a specification the Emperor selected deliberately, and what he selected from Fenris is inseparable from what makes the shamanism question complicated. Fenris is a death world of vast ice seas and continental predators. The Fenrisian wolves and other native fauna that hunt across frozen expanses large enough to swallow cities, in conditions that have kept the human population in a state of continuous survival mode for every generation they've existed on the surface. Leman Russ, their Primarch, arrived on Fenris via separated infant capsule and was raised by Fenrisian wolves, the massive semi-sentient pack hunters that are among the world's apex predators, before the Emperor found him. Russ spent his formative period as something between a man and a wolf in the most literal available sense, and what Fenris made him, the Space Wolves became when he turned his legion into his image. Their culture draws from Fenrisian mythology with genuine structural depth. The rune priests operate within shamanic traditions that involve omens, spiritual forces, and the saga weight of a mythological worldview that shapes how the chapter interprets its history and its function. Their organizational memory lives in sagas, oral and written traditions that carry the chapter's identity across generations. Their rejection of the Codex Astartes, Gilliman's post-heresy framework for how Space Marine chapters should be organized, deployed, and administered, was complete and entirely unapologetic. The Space Wolves weren't going to restructure themselves according to specifications from Ultramar, and they maintained that position for 10,000 years, operating as 13 great companies rather than the standard chapter structure, integrating the Wolfen, Space Marines experiencing a genetic mutation that pushes them towards something feral, into their organization rather than treating them as a secret to be managed or purged. The Wolfen question is itself lore-rich. A genetic instability in the Space Wolves' gene seed, producing warriors who revert towards something closer to the Fenrisian wolves Rust was raised among. The chapter's response is to treat them as brothers, whose condition is honored rather than hidden, which produces both a more cohesive chapter culture and ongoing administrative difficulties with the Imperium's institutional structures. Loyalty to brothers over organizational tidiness has been the Space Wolves' answer to every question of that type. The flag under the Imperial Truth's provisions is the shamanism. Fenrisian spiritual practice carries the architecture of genuine religious tradition, not the values framework embedded in the Promethean cult, but actual mythological structure, with all the features an iterator would identify as requiring conversion. An Imperial iterator deployed on Fenris would have a busy assignment. The counter-argument is direct. The Space Wolves' spiritual practices aren't directed at the Emperor as a divine figure. Fenrisian shamanism draws from a homeworld, from cultural traditions predating the chapter's founding, from a worldview shaped by genuine survival conditions on a world that the Emperor chose as the source for one of his legions. He knew what Fenris produced when he found Rust there. Whether the Imperial Truth's prohibitions were designed specifically to prevent the worship structures that the setting's metaphysics establish as capable of feeding chaos, the Emperor devotion cults that produce the dangerous psychic energies the iterators were deployed to starve, or were intended as a universal prohibition covering all indigenous spiritual traditions, regardless of their direction and content, is genuinely ambiguous in the lore's own framing. The operational record removes any ambiguity about where the Space Wolves stand relative to the Emperor's actual requirements. Leman Russ was the Emperor's chosen instrument for punitive actions the Great Crusade needed someone specific to carry out. When the word-bearers required censure, the Emperor pointed at Fenris. The burning of Prospero, one of the most devastating, morally complicated, and consequentially lasting events of the Horus Heresy period, was carried out by the Space Wolves because the Emperor required it, and Russ accepted the requirement without equivocation. Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons were powerful, and their world burned because Terra demanded it, and the chapter from Fenris accepted that assignment even knowing what it would cost in brotherhood. The animosity between the Space Wolves' successors and the 1,000 Sons' successors still shapes lore in the 41st millennium because of what was done on Prospero on the Emperor's instruction. Verdict: cleared. He does not have standing to condemn the chapter he built as his enforcement mechanism and then used to burn a Primarch's homeworld. The shamanism of Fenris goes in the cultural inheritance column. It isn't post-founding theological drift, but a foundational characteristic the Emperor was aware of when he selected Russ. After Prospero, after carrying out the Emperor's worst assignments, after sacrificing brotherhood with Magnus's sons because Terra required it, the complaint about Fenrisian spiritual traditions isn't the conversation this verdict requires. Their independence is loyalty wearing Fenrisian clothes. That's not a conviction. The Grey Knights, conditional acquittal. The Grey Knights are the most legally complicated case in this entire proceeding, and that complexity begins before a single one of them has fired a shot in the founding conditions that produced them. Every Grey Knight is a psyker. Standard Space Marine chapters include librarians, Space Marines with psychic abilities serving specialist roles within a broader organization recruited on multiple criteria. The Grey Knights are different in kind, not degree. Selection begins at birth, specifically targeting psychic potential as the primary qualification. Every recruit is identified by their latent psychic ability first and trained from the earliest age with their psychic capabilities as the foundational element of their function. They aren't Space Marines who happen to include some psykers. They are a psychic force built on Space Marine biology, designed from the ground up around the assumption that every member will be a psyker of significant power. Their mission is demon hunting, specifically, not the general warfare that most chapters exist to prosecute. Demonic incursions specifically, addressed covertly, at security classifications that sit above all other Imperium security thresholds. They operate unacknowledged. Their existence isn't confirmed in official records accessible to standard Imperial personnel. If you witness them operating and you aren't one of them, the established practice is that you don't leave to tell anyone what you saw. Civilians, guardsmen, other Imperial forces on occasion. Witnesses get purged because operational secrecy at their level recognizes no exceptions and treats the maintenance of concealment as non-negotiable. Their founding is where the jurisdictional problem becomes load-bearing. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, his second-in-command, the figure who maintained the Golden Throne during the Emperor's physical confrontation with Horus and was destroyed by that effort, laid the groundwork for the Grey Knights during the siege of Terra itself. The timing wasn't administrative convenience. The siege was the crisis that threatened to end everything. And Malcador was simultaneously maintaining the throne, working to stabilize the Emperor's forces, and initiating the creation of a secret demon-hunting chapter. He set the founding in motion during the worst hours in Imperial history. Then the burden of holding the throne killed him. Whether the Emperor explicitly directed Malcador to found the Grey Knights, a direct command issued with full sanction before the siege consumed the space for such decisions, or whether Malcador acted on presumed authority, doing what he believed the Emperor would want during a crisis that might not leave an Emperor available to authorize anything afterward, is contested in the lore and doesn't resolve cleanly. This is the founding ambiguity. The chapter that has spent 10,000 years defending the Imperium against its most dangerous threat may have been founded without the Emperor ever explicitly saying so. The mission Malcador was assigned was to die maintaining the throne. Everything else he did in those final hours was done in the Emperor's name, by a man who knew he was about to cease to exist and was trying to construct what the future would need anyway. The argument for them is operational necessity at its most absolute. Daemons are real. The Emperor knew this and deliberately excluded it from the Imperial truth as a containment strategy. That exclusion created a gap, a category of threat that the Imperium's official doctrinal framework refused to publicly acknowledge, which meant it could never publicly address. The Grey Knights exist to address it. Their all-psyker composition reflects a sophisticated, technically accurate understanding of what fighting chaos at the foundational level actually requires. They function, which matters enormously when the alternative to their functioning is demonic incursion proceeding without a specialized response. The argument against them is the witness purging, which has a specific quality that distinguishes it from standard classified operations secrecy. Executing guardsmen who witnessed a Grey Knight's deployment isn't only operational security. It's the systematic maintenance of Imperial ignorance about categories of threat Imperial citizens face daily, by eliminating everyone who might disturb that ignorance. What the Grey Knights protect through this practice is the manufactured fiction the Imperial truth created deliberately, the Imperium's institutionalized not knowing about the warp, extended from philosophical containment strategy into active enforcement of civilian ignorance through lethal means. The method echoes the original concealment. The object being protected is the Emperor's specific decision to build a civilization that didn't know what it was up against. Verdict: conditional acquittal. The demon-hunting mission is necessary work, and the chapter's design suggests genuine understanding of what fighting chaos requires at the level of physics and metaphysics rather than military doctrine. The witness purging is a structural problem that the Emperor's stated principles wouldn't recognize as defensible. It treats the void the imperial truth left as an asset to maintain rather than a liability to address. But the Grey Knights exist because the imperial truth created that void and left it unfilled, and they have been filling it imperfectly for 10 millennia. The real indictment in their case doesn't belong to the chapter. It belongs to the gap, and that particular ledger entry goes on the Emperor's own accounting. He built the doctrine that couldn't acknowledge what they exist to fight. The Black Templars, guilty. Complicated. The Black Templars were founded by Sigismund, first captain of the Imperial Fists, described across heresy-era lore as one of the most accomplished individual warriors of the entire conflict. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, their founding mission was an eternal crusade conducted in the Emperor's name. They don't maintain traditional homeworlds or permanent fortress monasteries the way most chapters establish fixed operational bases. The Black Templars crusade because crusading is simultaneously the mission, the method, and the animating theology of everything they are. Sigismund established a chapter designed to be perpetually at war, perpetually in motion, perpetually carrying the Emperor's name into whatever enemy currently presented itself. Their founding doctrine wasn't a strategic posture that developed over centuries. It was the original design. What that founding produced 10,000 years later is the Imperium's most theologically enthusiastic Space Marine chapter. The Black Templars treat the Emperor as a god. In an Imperium already saturated with Emperor worship, the Imperial cult is state religion. The ecclesiarchy maintains the institutional infrastructure of a galactic theocracy. Worship of the God Emperor is mandatory cultural architecture in most imperial contexts. The Black Templars distinguish themselves by the intensity and intentionality of their devotion. Their warrior monks carry relics with active devotional significance integrated into their combat operations. Their chaplains function in registers that would have been unambiguous grounds for a Monarchia-style response during the operational Great Crusade. Their crusading forces maintain battlefield shrines as standard deployable infrastructure. The theological dimension of their warfare isn't ambient cultural background noise accumulated passively over centuries. It's the explicit, intentional, doctrinally foundational reason they fight as effectively as they do. And they know it, and they construct their entire identity around it. They also reject librarians, Space Marine psykers, within their ranks. The chapter most enthusiastically devoted to the Emperor as a divine being is simultaneously the most deeply suspicious of psychic power within their own organization, framing it as corruption adjacent, theologically suspect, the kind of thing a properly devoted chapter doesn't trust. The most vocally anti-rational chapter in the Imperium is anti-rationalist across the board. No psychic power permitted within their ranks. Full divine devotion to the Emperor as God. Permanent crusade as the operational expression of that devotion. These positions are internally consistent in a way that makes them more troubling rather than less. They have built a coherent worldview whose coherence is exactly what the Emperor's iterators were deployed to dismantle, and they have maintained it for 10 millennia. The case for conviction is the most direct in this entire proceeding, and it doesn't require much construction. The Black Templars have spent 10,000 years doing precisely what the Emperor spent the Great Crusade suppressing. They built the military religious order that got Monarchia leveled. Sigismund's founding doctrine is the theological drift the imperial truth was specifically engineered to prevent, preserved, and cultivated, and codified, and passed down through 100 crusades across 100 centuries. The Emperor stood in the rubble of a city he ordered destroyed and called this specific category of behavior a poison to truth. The Black Templars have been breathing that poison as operational doctrine since before the 32nd millennium. Guilty on the specific charge isn't a difficult verdict to reach. The counter-argument is harder to dismiss than the verdict makes it sound. The Black Templars have been fighting, continuously, across every century, in every theater where imperial presence mattered, and in some where it didn't until they arrived and made it matter. They crusade because they believe, and the belief produces operational tempo that other chapters can't match. And that tempo has generated results the Imperium has needed for every millennium of the long war against everything the galaxy has produced to threaten humanity's survival. They don't recalculate when the numbers suggest recalculation would be the rational response. They don't identify withdrawal positions before the engagement makes withdrawal necessary. They fight because the fight is sacred. The sacredness of the fight is what makes them functionally unstoppable in engagements where other chapters would identify a strategic retreat. And functionally unstoppable is a genuine asset in a setting where the enemies arrayed against the Imperium don't operate on human timescales or accept negotiated outcomes. Does battlefield effectiveness justify theological doctrine the Emperor explicitly condemned? His record at Monarchia says no. He leveled an entire city to make that specific point, as an active demonstration that operational utility does not redeem the worship he prohibited. But Monarchia happened when a functioning secular Imperium was still a live project, when the imperial truth was operational doctrine with active enforcement mechanisms, when the Emperor was physically present to enforce it. The Black Templars exist in a galaxy where none of those conditions apply. They live inside the imperial cult's framework the same way every other chapter does, born into an Imperium where the secular framework the prohibition depended on had already ceased to function before their founding. Their version of it's louder than most. The distinction is magnitude rather than category. Guilty of the specific charge, everyone in the chamber knows it, including them. The worship is exactly what the Emperor prohibited and exactly what they practice. That verdict stands without equivocation, because the Emperor's words from Monarchia allow no other conclusion. What happens after the verdict is where the geometry becomes genuinely complicated, because the Imperium they were born inside, the one he left behind when he climbed onto the throne, was already building the religion they would inherit. They intensified what the institution gave them, shaped by a founder whose zeal was real and whose theological development occurred entirely within the post-heresy imperial cult's framework. There is also the matter of who is delivering this verdict and from what. The Emperor condemning the Black Templars for worshipping him carries full philosophical force. It also carries the weight of being delivered from a golden throne that requires 1,000 human sacrifices per day to maintain the judgment seat, a fact the Black Templars are entirely aware of, which is part of what they understand as evidence for his divinity. The hypocrisy isn't hidden, it's structural, and the Black Templars aren't the only ones in the room who can see it clearly. They're wrong about the Emperor being a god. He said so himself in those exact terms in the rubble of a city he destroyed to prove it. That verdict stands. The context explaining how they got here doesn't erase it. It just means the judge has to deliver this particular condemnation, knowing full well his own ledger entry is visible to everyone present. This is the verdict with no clean outcome. The setting specializes in those. The Lamenters, fully acquitted. The Lamenters followed every principle correctly. They were destroyed for it anyway, systematically, across centuries, without ever receiving from the institution that destroyed them the acknowledgement that the fault was the institution's rather than their own. They emerged from the cursed 21st founding, a creation event in which several Space Marine chapters were produced with genetic irregularities and what the lore characterizes as unusual misfortune running through their existence as a consistent operational condition. The cursed founding produced multiple troubled chapters. The Lamenter's particular inheritance combines the genetic irregularities of their founding with what functions as a lore-consistent pattern of catastrophic misfortune that does not relent at any point in their documented history. Their armor is yellow. Their heraldry is a black heart on the chest. Both turn out to be accurate heraldry for everything that happens to them. The yellow is distinctive enough to be recognized on any battlefield. The heart is there to be broken. During the Badab War in the 41st millennium, a conflict in which several Space Marine chapters entered into rebellion against Central Imperial authority, disputing tithe obligations and chapter autonomy in a prolonged armed confrontation. The Lamenters fought on the secessionist side. That is the fact of the matter. What the fact describes, in full context, is a chapter that was deceived about the nature of what they were joining, whose intentions throughout the conflict remained loyalist, and whose tactical alignment in the war was a catastrophic miscalculation made in good faith by a chapter that trusted information they had no reason to doubt at the time of the decision. When the full picture of the Badab War became clear, the Lamenters didn't attempt to reframe their role, to argue extenuating circumstances, or to seek the most favorable possible interpretation of their position. They acknowledged their error completely and without qualification. They submitted to judgment. They accepted full responsibility for a mistake that cost them significantly to acknowledge honestly. The Inquisition declared them traitors. The distinction between a loyalist chapter that chose the wrong side because it was deceived and a chapter that deliberately betrayed the emperor's civilization didn't survive the institutional processing. The Inquisition, operating under imperial cult doctrine, the theocratic administrative framework the emperor wouldn't have recognized as descended from anything he built, sentenced the Lamenters to a penance crusade, a mandatory period of redemptive service at the Imperium's frontier, conducted under the explicit institutional framing that they were purchasing back their standing through blood and continued sacrifice. The Lamenters accepted this. They submitted to a sentence administered by an institution operating through doctrine entirely foreign to the emperor's original principles, because the Imperium was still worth serving even when the Imperium was wrong about them. And they went. In 992 M41, the Tyranids found them. The Penance Crusade's routing placed the Lamenters directly in the path of the Second Tyrannic War, into a Tyranid hive fleet advancing across the galaxy's eastern fringe, into the grinding attrition of a biomechanical predator civilization whose operational objective is the total consumption of every biological resource on every world it encounters. The Tyranids don't negotiate. They don't recognize penance as a concept. They arrived, and the Lamenters, already bled white by decades of penitent service at the Imperium's most exposed frontiers, already carrying the accumulated weight of the Badab War's unjust sentence and everything before it, walked into them anyway, because the penance required it and they had accepted the penance. They suffered catastrophic losses. The chapter that had already given more than it was asked to give walked into a Tyranid grinder as the consequence of penance for loyalism that had been misidentified as betrayal, administered through the authority of an institution the emperor wouldn't have recognized, using doctrine built on the religion he most explicitly forbade. They nearly didn't come out the other side. Their beliefs through all of this never drift toward emperor worship, never develop the theological extremism that marks the harder cases in this room. The Lamenters fight for people. Their doctrine protects civilians with the same foundational commitment the Salamanders maintain. They carry themselves with the particular quality of a chapter that has learned, empirically and repeatedly, that doing everything correctly offers no protection against an institution that has lost any connection to what correctly means, and that continues doing everything correctly regardless, because the alternative is becoming what destroyed them, and they aren't willing to do that. The detail that defines the verdict. The penance was real to them regardless of whether the charge was just. They submitted to a judgment that had no legitimate basis in the emperor's actual principles, administered by an institution that had replaced those principles with something unrecognizable, and they served every day of it because the Imperium remained worth serving, even when the Imperium was catastrophically wrong about them. That isn't naive loyalty. That is a chapter that understood the difference between the institution and the ideal it had once represented, and chose to serve the ideal through an institution that had forgotten the ideal existed. Verdict: fully acquitted. Not on technicalities, on substance, on what they actually did and who they actually were, through 10 millennia of unearned catastrophe and institutional failure directed specifically at them. The Emperor's acknowledgement in this verdict needs to extend past the chapter's record to the institution that punished them. The Inquisition that sentenced the lamenters to penance operated without any authority traceable to what the emperor actually built. Its jurisdiction derived from the religion he forbade, administering a punishment for loyalism in a setting where the measuring stick for loyalty had been replaced by the imperial cult's definitions, rather than anything the imperial truth would recognize. The yellow armor with the black heart went into the Tyranids because these space marines believed the Imperium was worth serving even when the Imperium was wrong about them. That is the clearest expression of loyalty in this entire setting, and it received, as its operational return, a penance crusade and a Tyranid hive fleet. The conspicuous absence. One name hasn't appeared in any of these proceedings, and his absence is the final fact the analysis requires before the Emperor's own verdict gets delivered. Roboute Guilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium, resurrected Primarch of the Ultramarines, the son who came back from death and found 10,000 years of exactly the decay he would have predicted, isn't present for any of this. Canonically, his position is confirmed. After the first phase of the Indomitus Crusade concluded around 012 M42, Guilliman returned to the realm of Ultramar. He had stabilized the Imperium Sanctus during the Crusade and then left it because there was more work to do elsewhere. Ongoing military campaigns. Administrative reconstruction of structures that had been decaying since before the heresy. The grinding, daily, unspectacular institutional labor of trying to hold together an imperium that was falling apart before the Great Rift and is now falling apart faster after it. Guilliman has more specific reason than any other surviving figure to be present for these hypothetical proceedings. He came back from death to find the civilization his father built had degraded into the precise theocratic nightmare the imperial truth was specifically engineered to prevent. His documented discomfort with being treated as a demigod is consistent throughout his post-resurrection lore. The son who was handed administrative authority over a galactic theocracy and found the entire apparatus philosophically appalling is the one most urgently positioned to hear what the Emperor has to say about every chapter that grew up inside it. The lore establishes that Guilliman encountered evidence that the Emperor knew about Lorgar's worship spreading before acting on it, and that this knowledge left him in a state of profound disillusionment about the nature of what his father had actually been willing to accept. He is the Primarch who most actively attempts to restore something resembling functional, rational governance. He does this without the authority of divinity, without the leverage of 10,000 years of accumulated worship, without anything except his name and his record, and his refusal to accept that the rot is irreversible. He is doing, by grinding institutional work, approximately what the Emperor would need someone to do, and he is doing it in Ultramar, away from Terra, while events he would most need to witness happen without him. He missed the judgment session. He always misses the great events. He is somewhere drafting policy documents that the people responsible for implementing them are currently finding reasons to ignore, stabilizing a sector and then moving to the next one, trying to rebuild the secular administrative competence the Imperium hasn't exercised meaningfully in 10,000 years. The joke is real. Guilliman, once again, missing the event that mattered. The devastation underneath the joke is equally real. The one son trying hardest to honor what the Emperor actually wanted wasn't in the room when the Emperor confirmed it, wasn't present to hear his father deliver the verdicts that would validate everything Guilliman has been arguing since the moment he opened his eyes in the 41st millennium and surveyed the ruin. He's doing the work. The ceremony of being told he's right happened without him. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. The verdict the Emperor cannot deliver on himself. Every chapter that stood for judgment drifted during 10 millennia of imperial cult corruption. The ones that drifted toward compassion, toward the actual substance of what the Emperor's civilization claimed it existed to protect, came through with their records intact, or their flaws attributed correctly to wounds rather than choices. The ones that drifted toward worship present harder verdicts that the Emperor has genuine standing to deliver, and he should deliver them, and the standing is real. But the indictment that doesn't get delivered in this hypothetical courtroom is the one aimed at the judge, The imperial truth died during the Horus heresy because the heresy disproved its foundational claim at maximum possible scale. That claim was already incomplete when deployed. The emperor knew the warp existed and deliberately excluded it as a containment strategy, which means the secular manifesto that iterators spread across 10,000 worlds was never fully honest. When demons physically walked Terra, the framework that had no vocabulary for demons couldn't survive the evidence. What replaced the imperial truth was the imperial cult, and the imperial cult wasn't an accident, a conspiracy, or an error of institutional management. It was the predictable result of a specific choice the emperor made at the Siege of Terra. He climbed onto the Golden Throne. When he destroyed Monarchia, he demonstrated that the imperial truth required active defense by someone with authority and physical presence enforcing it in real time. The iterators could spread doctrine. The intelligence apparatus could suppress faiths with extreme prejudice. But none of it survived without the emperor present and capable of standing in rubble and saying, "This is what the violation costs." The moment he stepped into the Golden Throne, he surrendered both authority and presence permanently. The religion he hated wasn't going to stay out of the vacuum he created. It was going to fill it, because the setting's metaphysics guarantee it. Belief creates real entities in the warp. The chaos gods exist because they are constructed from the collective psychic weight of mortal experience across billions of sentient beings. A figure receiving devotional energy from quadrillions of humans for 10,000 years does not opt out of what that belief constructs around him because he finds the construction philosophically distasteful. He forbade worship, then he provided the most powerful possible object of worship in the history of human religion. A martyred god-king, motionless on a throne of gold, requiring 1,000 human sacrifices every single day to sustain the civilization built in his name. The Golden Throne is, in structural terms, the most elaborate altar ever constructed. The daily death toll is the most sustained act of ritual sacrifice in recorded fiction. He can't call it an altar because he is inside it. The sacrifice can't be stopped because stopping it ends everything. The religion can't be dismantled because the religion is now load-bearing infrastructure for imperial interstellar civilization. He built the religion he hated through the heresy's destruction of the secular framework, through the martyrdom on the throne that made deification inevitable, through 10,000 years of human sacrifice directed at his motionless body, making the theological claims of the imperial cult irrefutable to any civilization living inside their operational consequences. The chapters were born into an imperium where the imperial truth had already ceased to function and the imperial cult had already replaced it, and they drifted in the directions their inheritance pointed them. Some drifted better than others. The verdicts reflect that accurately. The real Old Testament act in Warhammer 40,000 was never the judgment. The Old Testament act was the martyrdom that made judgment necessary. He built the church he had always sought to destroy. One choice compounding on another, 1,000 psykers per day feeding the altar he can't acknowledge as an altar. And now he sits clothed in the authority of a divinity he explicitly rejected and sentences his sons for believing what the institution he left behind told them to believe. That is the tragedy. It's also, when you hold it at the right angle, the joke. The galaxy's most committed atheist performed the most cosmically religious act available to him by choosing to be the martyr his civilization needed, and in making that choice, handed every chapter born after the siege an imperium shaped entirely by the religion his martyrdom guaranteed. He judged them against a standard the institution he created had already abandoned. He judged them from a throne that the institution built around his dying body as an altar. He judged them with the authority of divinity he spent the Great Crusade trying to prevent anyone from attributing to him. And somewhere in Ultramar, Rabute Gilliman is writing policy documents and not getting the memo. Games Workshop has spent 40 years refusing to resolve any of this. The verdicts write themselves from the lore if you're willing to follow the evidence where it goes. The emperor judged his sons, rightly, with specific standing on every charge that deserved it. He also built the conditions every verdict was measured against, and the courtroom he judged them in was constructed from the hypocrisy the verdicts were designed to condemn. There was never a version of this that came out clean. The setting has always known that. The audience has always known it too. That's why they're still here. Subscribe for more stories like this.